I'm Dr. Judy Melinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference, and I wanted to share some context for everyone. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death, and the thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. Also for any kind of traumatic injuries. Now we got to talk about natural death for a second. If someone has a heart attack while they are swimming, and because they're having the heart attack as they're exercising in the water and they take on water and they drown, the cause of death is actually drowning, and the heart attack is listed on the death certificate under other significant conditions contributing to death. So even though the heart attack might have killed them on dry land, it might not have. Most certainly they wouldn't have drowned on dry land. So we defer to the hostile environment, which is the water, to call it a drowning. Now, identifying natural disease and identifying trauma is relatively easy in a fresh body. It can be very difficult in a decomposed body. His body was found 2 days after he disappeared, and this second autopsy done by Dr. Roger Mitchell wasn't until 4 days later. So we're dealing with quite a bit of decomposition, even if the body was refrigerated during that time. And then we have this other issue of the fact that not all the results are back. The toxicology would have been done on the fluids from the body from the first autopsy. From the second autopsy, you're going to have a lot higher alcohol levels from the decomposition caused by bacteria, not caused by drinking. So again, it's the fluid and blood from the first autopsy that really matter. And the other thing you have to consider, and there's one other important piece of information from that press conference, which is that the neck block, the portion of the neck from the front end, was missing. So Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well if, injury comes from behind, but generally this part of the neck doesn't have the major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office that was not released with the body. So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that neck block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy that has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. So why should anybody do a second autopsy? A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence, they have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. And to answer the question, if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just, too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning, but the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to 0.20 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving, but you can get up to 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. So I hope this answers some questions about what I saw in the press conference, what other people saw as well. I will go through the autopsy, or at least the report that's been released, with a fine-tooth comb, but this is just my first impressions based on watching the press report. As always, if you have any questions, put them in the comments. I'll see if I can answer them. And we really need to wait for the medical examiner's report to find out what really was found at the autopsy when the body was fresh. I think that's going to clarify a lot of things.
There is a jar in a medical examiner's office in Mississippi, and inside it is the front of Nolan Wells' neck. Not lost, not destroyed by the water, not eaten away by the days his body spent in the Gulf before anyone found him. Simply kept, retained by the state, and never released with the rest of him. And here is the part that should stop everyone cold. Before that tissue was ever examined, before the full autopsy was even finished, the public had already been told there was no foul play. You just heard a forensic pathologist explain why that single detail may matter more than anything else in this case. Because if a person is strangled by hand, the evidence does not scatter. It concentrates, almost entirely, in the front of the neck, the small, horseshoe-shaped bone that can fracture under pressure, the thin muscles where tiny vessels rupture, the pinpoint marks that appear when the airway is squeezed. All of those signs live in the exact region that was retained, and never placed in front of the independent examiner the family brought in. That examiner, one of the most respected in the country, still could not call it. His finding was a single, careful word: undetermined, not accident, not homicide, undetermined, because you cannot rule out what you were never allowed to examine, and that is the trap at the center of everything. It is not that the evidence proves a crime. Nothing here proves a crime, and no one has been charged with one. It is that the one piece capable of answering the question was the one piece kept behind a locked door, described in a report the public still has not seen. So the question this whole case now turns on is not who. It is this: how does anyone stand in front of a camera and rule out foul play in the death of an 18-year-old before the examination that determines foul play has even been done? Stay with me, because the retained neck tissue, a toxicology number that can deceive without anyone lying, and a report now locked away for a grand jury all bend back toward that one question. Before we go any further, like this video, subscribe, and drop the location and the time you are watching from in the comments. It costs you nothing, and it tells us how far Nolan's story is actually reaching. Now, back to the order this was handled in, because the order is the whole problem. A cause of death is not something you guess at the shoreline. It is a finding, and a finding is the last thing that happens, not the first. You arrive at it only after every other explanation has been tested and closed off, one at a time. That order is not a formality. It is the entire discipline of forensic pathology, and it exists precisely because bodies recovered from water are the easiest of all to misread. Dr. Judy Melinek, the board-certified forensic pathologist whose analysis opened this video, put it plainly. Drowning is what pathologists call a diagnosis of exclusion. That means an examiner cannot simply look at a body pulled from the Gulf and write down drowning. Water hides almost everything. A person can drown, or a person can die some other way and end up in the water afterward, and to the eye the two can look nearly identical. So the examiner has to work backward, ruling out head injury, neck injury, drug toxicity, internal damage, everything else first. Only when every other door is shut can drowning be written as the answer. Now hold that against what actually happened. Within days of Nolan Wells being pulled from the water off Horn Island, the Jackson County Sheriff, John Ledbetter, and the county coroner had already framed this publicly. The coroner, Bruce Lynd Jr., told reporters there were no immediate, obvious signs of foul play or trauma. The sheriff's early statement went further, and it is the one that traveled. No foul play suspected. Even a policing analyst speaking to CNN later suggested that phrase may have been a poor choice of words, that it would have been more accurate to say only that there were no immediate signs. But by then the phrase was already everywhere. It helps to understand who was speaking and when. A coroner and a medical examiner are not the same office, and in Mississippi the difference matters. A county coroner is often an elected local official whose job is to confirm a death and its broad circumstances, not to perform the deep forensic autopsy. The medical examiner is the physician who does the scientific examination. So when the coroner said there were no immediate, obvious signs of foul play, he was describing a first look, not a completed autopsy. The trouble was never that a coroner made an early observation. The trouble was that an early observation got heard by the public as a final scientific conclusion, and no one moved quickly to correct that. Here is why that matters more than it sounds. A statement made on camera by an official carries enormous weight, whether or not the science is in yet. Once the word accident is in the air, that framing follows a case everywhere it goes. It shapes how hard evidence gets chased. It shapes what the public believes before it knows anything. It shapes how much pressure exists to keep looking. You examine first, and you conclude second. Here, that order was reversed, and once it is reversed, it is very hard to undo. And the timeline made the stakes worse, not better. Nolan was last seen on the afternoon of the 4th of July on Horn Island, an uninhabited strip of federally protected sand about 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, reachable only by boat and packed that day with holiday crowds. He was reported missing that night. His body was found 2 days later, on the morning of the 6th of July, in the water near the island's shore. Every one of those hours in the water changed what his body could still tell anyone. Decomposition does not pause to wait for investigators to catch up, which makes it stranger, not more reassuring, that the confident public wording came so early, at exactly the moment caution should have been highest. To be fair to the officials, it is possible the sheriff saw something at the scene that shaped his words, but an impression at a scene is not a documented, reviewable finding, and it is not something an outside expert can weigh. That distinction is the seam this entire case has split along. One quick thing before we go on, because it grows straight out of what this case keeps proving. So much of what hurts people never looks like a threat while it is happening. It looks ordinary. It looks trustworthy. It looks like the last thing you would ever need to worry about, right up until the moment it is too late to unsee it. Dangerous people work the same way. They do not announce themselves. They give quiet signals long before they ever act. Signals that only look obvious in hindsight. That is exactly why I wrote my book, How to Spot Dangerous People Before They Hurt You. Not to teach fear, but to teach recognition. Inside it you will learn how dangerous people think, the warning signs they give long before they act, and the behaviors that could protect your life or the life of someone you love. And it is completely free. The link is in the description. Read it before you ever need it, not after. Now, back to the 2 autopsies, and the piece missing from the second one. Understand that there was not one autopsy in this case. There were 2. And the gap between them is where the whole dispute lives. The first was the official one, conducted by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office. The coroner's office had requested it precisely so the state could determine whether there was foul play or trauma. That examination has been completed. Its report has not been released. The second was independent, and the family paid for it themselves. They did not wait for the process to come to them, so they went to it. Nolan's body was flown from Mississippi to Washington, D.C., so that a pathologist with no ties to Mississippi law enforcement could examine him. The attorney representing the family, the civil rights lawyer Ben Crump, was blunt about why. In his words, it was not adding up. The pathologist they brought in was Dr. Roger Mitchell, Jr., a former chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C., and one of the most respected forensic pathologists in the country. He performed the independent examination on the 10th of July, 6 days after Nolan disappeared and 4 days after his body was recovered. And when his preliminary findings were released, they did not say accident. They did not say homicide either. They said the cause and manner of Nolan's death were undetermined pending further investigation. That word gets misread constantly, so let us be exact about it. Undetermined does not mean nothing happened. It does not mean the family's concerns are imaginary. It means the available evidence was not enough to close the door on any single explanation. One side gave a fast, confident answer. The other side, looking more carefully and later, said honestly that it could not be sure. That is not two experts feuding over interpretation. That is a professional declining to claim more than the evidence supports. So why could an examiner of that caliber, with the family's full cooperation and the body in front of him, not reach a firmer conclusion? Because an autopsy can only examine what is physically in front of it. And something essential was not. There is something counterintuitive worth understanding about which autopsy carries the most weight, because it cuts against the instinct of this case. Dr. Melinek made the point directly. The medical examiner's autopsy, the state's autopsy, is actually the most independent one there is. It is legally mandated, and it is not beholden to the family, or to the prosecutor, or to the police, or to anyone else. It is meant to answer to no one. That is precisely why its silence is so frustrating here. The examination designed to be the neutral one is the examination whose findings are locked away. A second, independent autopsy exists as a check on that system, for exactly the moments when a family fears it is not getting straight answers. But a second autopsy is never a clean restart, and it is important to understand why. Because it explains the undetermined finding better than any theory of conspiracy does. By the time a second examiner gets his turn, time has already done its damage, and in forensic science, time destroys information rather than preserving it. A body is a kind of record, but a record that fades with every passing hour. Nolan's body had already spent days in the water before it was recovered. Then, it went through the state's examination, which removed and retained the very structures a second examiner would want. Only after all of that did Dr. Mitchell get his turn. Refrigeration slows decay. It does not stop it. Water softens tissue and displaces the fine detail an examiner depends on. In effect, the second pathologist was reading a document that had already been left out in the weather, with pages torn out and kept somewhere he could not reach. That he came back with undetermined is not a failure of skill, it is an honest description of what was left to read. So, return to what was actually missing from his table. Dr. Mitchell wrote that the most significant limitation of his examination was that he could not directly observe the airway and the lungs for water, or directly examine the stomach for its contents. He could not do those things because parts of Nolan's body had already been removed and retained by the state during the first autopsy. And Mitchell himself pointed out that doing so is common practice. This is important, and we are going to be fair about it throughout. Retaining tissue is not, by itself, evidence of anything wrong. And notice what Mitchell specifically said he could not do. He could not directly observe the airway and the lungs for water. That sounds technical, but it goes to the heart of the whole question. In a true drowning, one of the few positive signs an examiner can look for is fluid where it should not be, in the airway, in the lungs. It is part of how you confirm that water was actually breathed in, rather than a body simply coming to rest in water after death, when the very structures that would show that were already removed. The independent examiner lost not only the ability to look for strangulation, but part of the ability to confirm drowning either. The missing piece is cut in both directions at once. But consider what was retained, and why it lands so hard in a case where strangulation has even been raised as a question. The structure at issue is the front of the neck, what examiners sometimes call the neck block. And Dr. Melinek explained, in the analysis that opened this video, exactly why that region is the one that matters. If someone dies by manual strangulation, by pressure from the hands, the evidence concentrates almost entirely in the front of the neck, not the back. The back of the neck is mostly muscle and spine. The front is where the airway sits, where the major blood vessels run, and where the physical signs of pressure would appear, if they appear at all. There are 3 specific things a forensic examiner looks for. The first is the hyoid bone, a small, delicate, horseshoe-shaped bone high in the front of the throat, largely unprotected, which in some manual strangulation cases can fracture under pressure. The second is the strap muscles, the thin muscles running down the front of the neck, where tiny blood vessels can rupture internally under compression, leaving signs a trained eye can find even when the surface looks untouched. The third is a pattern of pinpoint hemorrhages, the tiny bursts that appear when small vessels give way under sustained pressure, often in the eyes, the face, or the lining of the heart. Together, those 3 form a recognizable pattern, and pattern recognition is the foundation of the entire field. All 3 of those signs live in the exact region that was retained by the state and never handed to the independent examiner. That is the whole problem in a single sentence. Dr. Melinek was careful, and this channel is going to be just as careful. Without the front of the neck, she said, you cannot confirm strangulation. But you equally cannot rule it out. She did not say Nolan Wells was strangled. No responsible expert has said that. What she said is narrower and, in its way, heavier. The one piece of anatomy that could answer the question was the one piece the people trying to answer it independently were never given. And here is the honest limit of what anyone outside that office can say. There are 2 very different reasons a pathologist might retain that tissue, and from the outside they look identical. It could have been kept out of an abundance of caution, examined, found to show nothing, and simply held. Or it could have been kept precisely because it showed something. A fracture in that small hyoid bone, hemorrhage in the strap muscles, the physical signature of pressure. Dr. Melinek was explicit that until the first autopsy report is released, no one can know which of those it is. The retention is not the answer. It is the shape of the question, and the answer is in the report. And she is not alone in that read. Dr. Michelle Dupre, a former medical examiner reviewing the case from the outside, said the missing neck structures were very important to any determination of possible strangulation, and that while she understood why the original pathologist would keep that tissue for further study, its absence hampered the second autopsy. She also called it premature that authorities reached a no-foul-play conclusion as quickly as they did, and warned against the one thing that ruins investigations more than any other: tunnel vision. So the retention itself is not the scandal. The silence around it is. Because if the state retained that tissue, then the state examined that tissue. And whatever it showed exists somewhere in the first autopsy report. The report the public still has not seen. There is one more finding from the independent examination that has to be handled carefully, because it is exactly the kind of detail that gets twisted online within hours. Crump, announcing Mitchell's preliminary results, noted a discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head, the occipital region. And immediately, the internet did what it does. It heard discoloration and it wrote blow to the head. But that is not what the finding says, and the experts have been clear. There were no underlying skull fractures and no lacerations to the skin over that area. Discoloration, on its own, is one of the most ambiguous things a decomposed body can present. Dr. Melinek told ABC News that the way it was described, noted, but not characterized as trauma, was itself a signal that the pathologist was not certain it came from an injury at all. In a body that has begun to decompose, she explained, discoloration can simply be a consequence of decomposition. Other forensic experts reviewing the case raised the possibility of lividity, the natural pooling of blood after death, settling under gravity depending on how the body was positioned. So the discoloration is not evidence of an attack. It is a question mark. It could be trauma. It could be decomposition. It could be the ordinary work of gravity on a body that spent days in the water. And which of those it is may only be answerable with, once again, the fuller picture that the state holds and has not released. Every thread in this case runs back to the same locked drawer. The honest position here is not that something sinister has been proven. It is that too little has been shown for anyone to be as certain as the earliest statements sounded. There is a second complication in this case that sounds simple on paper and is anything but. Toxicology. A number on a lab report looks objective, and usually it is. But one measurement in particular can mislead badly without a single person lying, and that measurement is blood alcohol. In a fresh case, a blood alcohol reading generally means what it appears to mean. This was not a fresh case, and Dr. Melinek walked through why that changes the math completely. After death, as a body begins to decompose, bacteria become active, and those bacteria can produce alcohol on their own, entirely separate from anything the person ever drank. In a body that has undergone significant decomposition, that internally generated alcohol can climb surprisingly high. High enough, she noted, to cross the kind of threshold that would put a living person well over the legal limit to drive, produced purely by bacterial activity and not by a single sip. Now layer that onto Nolan's circumstances. His body spent days in the Gulf before it was recovered. There would have been decomposition, which means any alcohol reading tied to his case cannot be taken at face value. A careful examiner has to account for the level of decay, check the supporting chemical markers, and subtract what the bacteria may have manufactured. Dr. Melinek made a further point that matters here. The toxicology that actually means something is the toxicology drawn at the first autopsy, on the fresher samples. By the time of a second examination on a more decomposed body, the alcohol readings climb from bacteria, not from behavior. And this cuts in a specific direction. Because if a raw, unadjusted alcohol number were to surface, it could very easily be used to quietly close the story. He was drinking, he went in the water, case closed. Dr. Melinek's entire point is that the science does not allow that shortcut in a decomposed body. The number has to be interpreted, not simply read. And the interpretation, like everything else, depends on the first autopsy and its toxicology, which have not been released. Two problems then, and they are different in kind. One is about anatomy, the retained front of the neck. The other is about chemistry, a toxicology reading that requires context to mean anything. But notice where both of them lead. The same place. The same sealed report. The same locked drawer that no one outside the state has been allowed to open. A quick pause, because it is easy to lose the person inside all this procedure. The people who loved Nolan describe an 18-year-old who wanted everyone around him to feel good, to feel like they had purpose, and who would lift up a total stranger just for being near him. So write his name in the comments. Just Nolan. Not for the algorithm, but for a kid who made other people feel like they mattered. Now, the contradiction sitting at the heart of the official story. You cannot call something a settled accident and also describe it as an active investigation. Because if it is still being investigated, it was never as settled as it first sounded. And that is exactly the shift that happened. When a reporter pressed officials in person for direct answers rather than statements, the tone had changed. The early confidence had softened into a much vaguer phrase. The case remained under active investigation. That is the tell. The strong, clean word from the first days, accident, quietly gave way to the language of a case that is still open. When pressed for specifics, officials offered little, at times pointing toward other departments rather than answering directly. This is where fair, non-accusatory questions started forming, and it is worth stating them carefully, because they are questions, not charges. In a small county, officials frequently know one another and work inside the same tight system. That alone is not wrongdoing. It is simply how small counties work. But it does raise a legitimate question about how confident the public can be that a review stayed fully independent when the people conducting it are personally connected to the world around the case. That question is not an accusation against anyone. It is the entire reason independent oversight exists in the first place, and it is a large part of why the family sought a second opinion at all. The family did not accept the first framing quietly. But they also did not respond with outrage for the cameras. They responded by hiring their own pathologist and by bringing in Ben Crump, a name familiar to anyone who follows cases where a family believes the official account is not the whole account. They were joined by the Reverend Al Sharpton and by the NAACP, whose national president criticized the speed of the early conclusions and stressed the need for a full investigation before anyone speculated about accident. Part of what drew national attention was impossible to separate from where this happened and who Nolan was. Nolan Wells was a black 18-year-old. In images from the trip, he appeared to be the only person of color among his friends. And this unfolded in Mississippi, a state whose history sits heavily over any case like this. Those facts did not decide what happened to Nolan. But they are why so many people watched so closely, and why the family's advocates refused to let the matter be waved off. Sharpton was careful about how he framed it, and his framing matters. He said he was not bringing race into the case, but he was not discounting it either, because no one yet knew what this was. That is not an accusation. It is a refusal to accept a conclusion in either direction before the evidence is in. And in a case where the first official word came before the examination did, that refusal is hard to argue with. At Nolan's funeral in Ocean Springs, Sharpton used his eulogy to lay out the questions the family cannot stop asking. He questioned why Nolan's friends had left him behind on that island. He questioned what happened with Nolan's phone and his keys. And he questioned why, when Nolan did not come back, he was not reported missing sooner. These are his questions, raised on behalf of a grieving family, and it is important to be precise about what they are and are not. They are not proof of anything, and they are not a charge against any named person. Nobody who was on that island has been charged with any crime, and this channel is not going to treat a witness as a suspect. But they are fair questions, and the honest truth is that they have not been publicly answered. There is at least a path toward answering one of them. When the family met with the Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath, both sides agreed to a mutual inspection of Nolan's cell phone, examined by experts for each party. A phone can hold a timeline. It can hold messages, locations, and the ordinary digital trail a person leaves without thinking. Whatever it holds in this case has not been made public, but the fact that both sides agreed to examine it together is one of the few genuinely cooperative steps in a case otherwise defined by what one side holds and the other side cannot see. Now, in fairness, and this matters as much as anything else in this video, there is a real and serious case for the simplest explanation. It deserves to be stated at full strength, not waved past. Sources cited by ABC News said Nolan was found wearing only swim trunks, face down in the water, a state that is consistent with drowning. He had gone to the island to swim on a hot holiday. The currents around Horn Island can be genuinely dangerous. The Jackson County Coroner has said his office has received drowning victims from Mississippi's barrier islands over the years, more than once. The island that day was crowded, boats nearly on top of one another, and by multiple accounts some people there had been drinking. The vice president of a search group that helped look for Nolan told CNN that if someone had gone into the water, the strong rip currents that day could have posed a real risk even to a capable swimmer. And Nolan's friends have consistently said he chose to stay behind. One account describing it as staying to talk to a girl, another describing a boat that had begun taking on water, with the belief that he would catch a ride back with someone else. None of that is nothing. Taken together, it describes a plausible, tragic accident, the kind that happens on that coast more often than people want to believe. An honest telling of this case has to hold that possibility open with real weight, because it may be the truth. The independent examiner did not rule out drowning. He ruled out certainty. And the difference between those two is the difference between an answer and an investigation. The family's position has never actually been that they know Nolan was murdered. Read Crump's words closely, and it is more disciplined than that. Their position is that the confident early conclusion was not earned, that the evidence capable of settling it is being withheld, and that they are entitled to see it. That is a demand for transparency, not a verdict. That transparency matters even more because of what has grown in the vacuum. In the absence of a released report, the internet has filled the silence, as it always does, with theories, names, and certainty nobody has earned. Private individuals who have not been charged with anything have been accused online. People connected to the case only as witnesses have had their faces circulated and conclusions attached to them that no evidence supports. In at least one instance, that has reached children, minors whose photographs have been spread across the internet by strangers building a story out of guesswork. This channel is not going to take part in that. And it is worth saying why out loud. Naming and accusing uncharged people, especially minors, on the strength of online suspicion is not investigation. It is harm. It is the same rush to a conclusion this entire case is a warning about, just pointed in a different direction. So the people who have not been charged will not be named here, their private lives will not be mined here, and their children will not appear here. If the evidence one day leads somewhere specific, the proper place for that is a grand jury and a courtroom, not a comment section. Holding that line is not softness. It is the only version of caring about the truth that does not create new victims along the way. So here is where the case actually stands as of this recording, and it moved recently. At a press conference at the National Urban League's annual conference in Nashville, Ben Crump appeared alongside Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, and did something that reframed this case as part of something larger. He placed Nolan's death beside two others. Daniel Irving, an 18-year-old who drowned at a lake in Texas in the spring after leaving with two other young men and not coming home, whose death was ruled an accidental drowning, and in whose case two teenagers have since been charged with tampering with physical evidence. And Tyler Smith, an 18-year-old who died of a gunshot wound at a 4th of July party in Kentucky. A death ruled accidental and self-inflicted, which his family disputes, and in whose case a young man has also been charged with tampering with evidence. 3 young black men, all 18, all dead within about 3 months of one another, and in each case a family that rejects or is still waiting on the official account. Crump's framing was direct. No one, he said, has been held accountable in any way. It is important to be exact here, because the cases are being discussed together and the details do not transfer. The tampering with evidence arrests are in the Texas and Kentucky cases. In Nolan Wells's case, as of this recording, no one has been arrested, no one has been charged, and no official cause of death has been released. Whatever similarities the families see, Nolan's case is legally its own, and it remains open. And the single most consequential update is this. The state's autopsy report on Nolan, the very document that could explain the retained tissue, the discoloration, and the toxicology all at once, will not simply be released to the public. It is being withheld until a grand jury can review it. The district attorney had already committed to presenting the case to a grand jury once the investigation is complete. So the answer to nearly every open question in this video now sits in the same place, waiting for the same closed proceeding. There is a wider frame around Nolan's case, and the 3 families now standing together are pointing at a pattern they believe is bigger than any one death. In each of their cases, a young black man died in circumstances that were quickly given an innocent, accidental explanation, and in each, the family pushed back and demanded the case go before a grand jury rather than end at an official's early word. Whether those cases are truly connected in any way beyond grief is not something anyone can claim to know. And this channel is not going to pretend the link is proven. What can be said is narrower. When a death is ruled accidental fast, and a family with resources and attention refuses to accept it, the mechanism they reach for is exactly the one now in play here. An independent autopsy to test the official story, and a grand jury to force the evidence into the open. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is the ordinary machinery of a family using every legitimate tool to make a system show its work. And in Nolan's case, that machinery is now fully engaged. The phrase grand jury does a lot of work here, and it is easy to picture the wrong thing. It is not a trial. A grand jury is a group of ordinary citizens who meet in secret to review evidence a prosecutor presents, and decide one narrow thing: whether there is enough to formally charge someone with a crime. It does not decide guilt. It does not hear a defense. Its proceedings are sealed by law, which is which is exactly why the state can hold its report until the grand jury has seen it. And a grand jury can go 2 ways. It can return charges, what is called an indictment, or it can decline to, and in plenty of cases it declines. So the grand jury is not a promise that anyone will be charged in Nolan's death. It is only a promise that the evidence will finally be examined by someone outside the circle that produced the first conclusion. There is a meaningful difference between a case that is unsolved and a case that is unfinished. Unsolved suggests the answers are gone. This case is unfinished, because the answers still exist. They just have not been released. And you can name exactly what would move it forward. The original state autopsy report, with the findings that could explain the condition of the body and justify why tissue was retained. The retained neck tissue itself, which has not been destroyed, only held, meaning a qualified independent examiner could still study it directly if given access, and a complete, properly interpreted toxicology report, one that accounts for decomposition rather than presenting a raw number stripped of context. None of those require anyone to speculate. They require release and access. Nothing more. So come back to the question this started with. How does anyone rule out foul play in the death of an 18-year-old before the examination that determines foul play has even been finished? The honest answer, the one this whole case keeps circling, is that no one should, and that the cost of doing it anyway is everything that has followed. A single confident sentence, spoken too early, set the frame. And once that frame was set, everything after it, the undetermined finding, the retained tissue, the softening into active investigation, the sealed report, has been a slow, grinding effort to pry the case back open to the level of caution it should have started with. Nothing in this video proves a crime. That has to be said plainly. One more time. Because it is true. No crime has been proven, no one has been charged, and the independent finding is undetermined, not homicide. What has been shown is smaller and, in its way, more unsettling. That an answer was offered before the work that produces answers was done. That the one piece of evidence able to settle the hardest question was kept out of the hands of the people trying to answer it independently. And that the document holding the rest is locked away until a room full of strangers decides, in secret, what happens next. That is not a closed case. That is a case waiting on a drawer to open. And when it does, the difference between an accident and something else will not come down to who spoke first or loudest. It will come down to what the tissue shows, what the toxicology means once it is read honestly, and what the report has been saying all along to the only people allowed to read it. If you want to know what that report says the moment it becomes public, this is the channel that will break it down, line by line, without spin, and without racing anyone to be first with something wrong. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because when the grand jury moves or the state report is unsealed, the difference between a rumor and the truth is going to matter, and getting it right is the entire reason this channel exists. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. By every account of the people who knew him, he wanted the people around him to feel good, to feel like they had purpose. And he would lift up a total stranger for no reason other than that they were there. He deserved to become whatever that kindness was going to grow into. He deserves, at the very least, an answer his family can stand behind. Say his name, and stay with this until there is one.